Do you have social anxiety about your social anxiety? Like, are you worried or anxious that people can tell how anxious you are? Um, if so, let's talk about it in this video. Hi, I'm Dr. Thomas Smithyman. I'm a clinical psychologist and I specialize in treating social anxiety. In this video, I want to talk about a phenomenon called the illusion of transparency. Very useful if you've got social anxiety. So essentially, social anxiety is a fear that we have flaws, and these flaws will be seen by others, and they'll be judged, will be rejected. So it's really a fear of being rejected for our flaws. There's a range of different common flaws that we worry about, but a very common one, and central to some of the treatment systems, is this idea that we're afraid of anxiety itself being observed. So we're worried that people will see the anxiety and think we're weak or criticize based on that. So for people, this might be a fear that it'll be shown on the face, or the hands will be shaking, or like blushing might happen, or sweating. Any of these physiological symptoms, or the inability to think of things. So this itself is seen as a flaw. So being afraid that our anxiety is itself a flaw causes a lot of problems. It does create this kind of escalating anxiety about anxiety, which in turn causes the real problems, which are the attempts to hide the anxiety or suppress what we're feeling or protect or escape. All those defensive maneuvers that really escalate anxiety over time and prevent us from reaching our goals. Those protective things cause weird behavior. They make us more self-focused. We also know from some studies that if you're feeling anxious and you try to suppress it, so you try to not feel it and not have it come across, that actually also increases anxiety. What's really, I think, useful to know is this concept called the illusion of transparency. It comes from Thomas Gilovich and some colleagues. He's a very inventive researcher. So he did a study in 2003 where he was really interested in public speaking anxiety. And he was really interested in this idea of people being nervous before a speech, which is pretty common, but then if they have this belief of, well, other people can tell that I'm anxious, that's going to make them more anxious. So he wanted to study this. So what he did was he set up a number of studies, a series, where he had people make speeches, and then he contrasted the difference between how they thought they came across versus how other people thought they came across. Really means, how anxious do I think I look versus how anxious did I actually look to the audience? And what he found across this series of studies, and then later replicated by others, is that consistently we come across as less anxious than we think we do. However anxious we feel, we don't look as anxious as that. Just good news and kind of interesting to know about. I find that when I do kind of similar things in treatment with people that have social anxiety, I'll tend to have them make speeches either in front of audiences or have conversations in front of audiences, or we'll very commonly videotape them doing these things so they can watch it back themselves. And what tends to happen is people might rate themselves as being like an 8 out of 10 for anxiety, but when we actually look at the videotape or we look at the ratings of other people, we find that that's very exaggerated. When you actually look and observe the videotape or the person doing it, their anxiety is probably more in the like 3 and below range. I do this a lot with people, and that's basically what I find. in general, however anxious somebody thinks they come across, when they actually look at it, they tend to rate themselves at about a third or a quarter as anxious in actual appearance. So why are we off here? Like, why do we think we come across as more anxious than we actually do? Well, I think a big piece of that is we are the only people who don't get to see how we come across. Everybody else is looking at us and observing. We don't have that. We're inside of ourselves looking out. We're the only ones who can't actually see ourselves. So, in the absence of information, we have to guess. And whenever we guess, it gives a lot of room for our skewed self-perceptions to get involved. So if we have skewed negative self-perceptions, if we're guessing how we come across, we'll probably skew negative. We tend to have negative views of the self. In the absence, again, of information, if we're deciding, well, how anxious do I look? All we can go off is how anxious we feel. So if I'm feeling really anxious, then I probably imagine, well, I must look really anxious, even though I don't actually have an external sense of that. So we end up comparing to other people. So we can observe them externally, but we can only observe ourselves internally. So for somebody else, we're only seeing the external manifestations of their anxiety, whereas for ourselves, we have access to our heart rate, to the amount of adrenaline we feel, we have access to the emotional. So that means we overestimate how anxious we might look because it's based on how we feel. They found, interestingly enough, they found the same phenomenon, this illusion of transparency, of how transparent my emotions are. This is not just for anxiety. This is sort of, it's in other areas of human life. So they found it for lying. So studies where people were told to lie, they imagined the lying was a lot more obvious to an audience than it was. The same thing with disgust, people drinking a disgusting drink. They internally felt disgust, but it wasn't externally observable to other people. They overestimated how obvious it was, how transparent they were. The kind of the takeaway from this is, however anxious you feel, you probably come across a lot less anxious than that. So, what to do about this? The good news, Gilovich did an extra study where he had people make a speech, but beforehand he told some of them all about the concept of the illusion of transparency, that what you feel internally is not directly observable to others. It comes across in a more muted way. And when he told people this before the study, they ended up going into their speech and being a lot less anxious and rating themselves as having made a better speech. So what this tells us is just knowing about the illusion of transparency means it makes you less anxious because you know that things don't bleed out as strongly. And when you are going into an anxiety-provoking situation and you do feel that internal stuff, just remind your threat system, this is an internal experience that I'm having. It doesn't get projected out fully. The more anxious you are in general, probably other people are not going to pick up on it as much. In my experience, it's maybe about a third as obvious as you think. And instead of focusing on the anxiety and trying to react or hide it, instead externalize your attention, focus on your goals, what you're in that situation to do, and focus on moving towards them while tolerating the discomfort. Okay, I hope that was interesting and helpful. Please comment. I always try to respond to those, make some videos. Okay, thank you.